Hello, everybody. Welcome to the session for today. Tanseinin Buju. Hello, everybody. Going to get our session started today here. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Craig Settee, and I'm the Indigenous Peoples Engagement and Research Council Coordinator here at the Can-SOLVE CKD Network, and I'm your host for today's event. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar called All My Relations, IPERC and Learning Pathways Information Sharing Session. And the reason for calling this session All My Relations is because there's a saying often in Indigenous communities where the speakers who are addressing everybody attending a gathering remind us of our responsibilities and our relationships to each other, to Mother Earth, and to the non-human beings, those spiritual beings, that we all strive towards living a good, healthy life. So all my relations. Just a little bit about myself. Buju, Sagasteo Napeo, Indigenous Makwanu Dudem, Ochegwasipi, Egwa Saskatchewan, Egwa Winnipeg, Nedunjiba, Pejik Medeo. So I just wanted to greet you in one of my languages today. So I am Cree and I am Anishinaabe. So I'm a citizen of Fish River Cree Nation, which is in the Interlake region of Manitoba. And I also have family connections to Dauphin River, Anishinaabe Nation, and Matheson Island, Manitoba, which are all communities that are in and around Lake Winnipeg. So next, I'd like to open with a land acknowledgement. First off, the Can-SOLVE CKD Network head offices are located on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people and home of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations there. Secondly, I'm hosting today's meeting from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and just wanted to share a quick teaching about those names. So Winnipeg is a Cree name for this place, and it loosely translates to muddy waters because of the Red River and Assiniboine rivers that come through this territory. And also the word Manitoba has its roots in Anishinaabe, which is the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe language, and loosely translates to Manitou Api, which could be said means a little bit about where a creator or where the spirit sits. So that's a little bit about Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is located in Treaty 1 territory. And it's the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, the Anishinaabe, the Dene, the Dakota, and it's also the birthplace of the Métis Nation and homeland of the Red River Métis. And there's also a small community and population of Inuit who are a part of Manitoba and the northern part of Manitoba. So with that, I'll ask to go on to the next slide. So before we move on further with our session today, I just want to take a moment to make note of some of the sensitive nature of today's content and just to provide a content warning to all of you joining us today. You know, as we delve a little bit deeper into the subject matter, I want to note that some of the content might be triggering to you and that there are resources available. So you'll see on our slide here, there are the Indian Residential School Survivors Society has a toll-free line, and there's also the Ku'us crisis line and website there. So I'll share this information again at the end of our presentation in case anybody needs to connect with these resources. Next slide. I'd also like to acknowledge that June is National Indigenous History Month, and then next Tuesday, June 21st, marks the summer solstice and National Indigenous Peoples Day. This is really a great time to honor the history, heritage, and diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And just a quick share that the reason I don't say people after that, after First Nations, Inuit and Métis, is because these names also in our languages reference us and are often translated as the people. And so Métis in Michif and Inuit in their language often refer to themselves as the people. And so for me, Anishinaabe, that is also a way of saying our nationhood, but also the way we say Anishinaabe, that's who we are, Anishinaabe people. So just wanted to share that. Next slide. As we celebrate the achievements of Indigenous peoples, we must also acknowledge the history, which includes the impact of colonization and colonialism. Recently, there was the one-year anniversary of the uncovering of the remains of 215 Indigenous children at the Kamloops Indigenous Indian Residential School, and a stark reminder of the devastating impact of the residential school system. There have since been many more uncoverings throughout Canada, and that the projected number of remains of our relatives is now over 10,000. And our hearts go out to the Kamloops to Secwepemc First Nation for being the first nation there to lead us in those uncoverings and really starting this whole process of more communities coming together to find our relatives around these sites of former residential schools. So tragedies such as this impact all of us differently, and it's important to take care of each other at this time. So if you need support, please know that there's resources available. And I just want to acknowledge that this is not only an Indigenous issue, it's a shared history. And it's important to note that although the last residential school closed in 1996, the intergenerational trauma of this part of Canadian history continues to today. Next slide. I'd like to provide an overview of today's webinar, which is a combination of live and pre-recorded video. So the first part of today's webinar, I'll give an overview of the Indigenous Peoples Engagement and Research Council, IPERC, here at Can-SOLVE CKD Network. And I'd like to make note that the council is currently meeting for the first time in 2 years in person here in Winnipeg, and we'd like to welcome you to our event today. The overview will meet members of IPERC and we'll learn about the council and our roles within the Can-SOLVE network and supporting projects. The second part of the workshop provides an overview of the Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj learning pathway, which aims to enhance researchers' knowledge and awareness of racial biases, Indigenous voices and stories, the impact of colonization on Indigenous health and culturally safe research practices. So more to come about the learning pathway in later slides. Now that we've heard some introductory words for today, I'd like to share these learning objectives with you. So we'll explore a little bit about Indigenous engagement that has occurred over the past 6 years and counting. A brief intro of the council members will be shared in addition to our roles and support of patient partners and projects as council. And lastly, we'll aim to gain an understanding of cultural competency in the context of Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj learning pathway and incorporating these elements into your circles of influence. Next slide. So with respect to questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box and we'll do our best to answer them all. Also, you can vote in favor of questions if somebody's asked maybe a similar question to yours, and we'll aim to answer some of the upvoted questions in here. Next slide, please. So over the next several slides, I'll provide this overview of IPERC. Just wanted to mention to you that IPERC was formed at the outset of Can-SOLVE in 2016 when it was formed, and so it's been a part of the network since its inception. One of the main reasons for an Indigenous Pacific Council is due to, unfortunately, the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples across the country being affected by kidney disease. And it's often been stated that 1 in 10 Canadians are affected by CKD, and in the Indigenous community, that number is closer to 1 in 4 people who are affected by kidney disease. Next slide, please. So with that staggering stat in mind, IPERC has been envisioned to guide the conduct of Can-SOLVE's activities in sharing the unique experiences and aspects of patient-oriented research that involves First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and that it also responds to the needs and concerns that are important health and wellness priorities for us and our communities as Indigenous people. Next slide, please. So IPERC's purpose really is to focus on the Indigenous patient partner voice and supporting our diverse perspectives of Indigenous peoples in connecting to the research and kidney education being done in the Can-SOLVE CKD network with our respective communities that we come from, and also with the research projects that are involved in the network's activities. And secondly, to developing resources to support patient partners and researchers to maintain respectful research and culturally competent engagement. So next slide, please. So here, this diagram here, I just wanted to highlight that there are two councils at the heart of the Can-SOLVE CKD network as patient partner governing bodies within Can-SOLVE CKD. And it's really to for patient partners to continue being leaders and sharing their needs and priorities of the work that we're doing in this network and in the field of kidney health research. And so IPERC is one of those two councils, and there is the Patient Governance Circle, which is the other. So IPERC members, as you see in this diagram, a number of other committees and working groups there too. IPERC members are also involved and sit on a number of these other committees and working groups throughout the network. And some examples that I just like to highlight are, there are some members that sit on the Research Operations Committee. There are IPERC co-chairs who also sit on the steering committee. And I think an important aspect for our work going forward too is really having a good voice at the knowledge translation and mobilization committee, because that's really a big focus, is mobilizing this knowledge that we've developed in over the past few years, and continuing that work forward. And really an important part of this work is this last point here about the executive committee, which is has also embraced two new members to its leadership team there, and they are Dr. Malcolm King and one of our IPERC co-chairs, Mary Bocage. And so they'll be bringing our Indigenous voices to that leadership table as well, and highlighting that throughout our work within Can-SOLVE going forward. Next slide, please. So here, I would like to highlight our council. So these are the patient partners who are involved in IPERC. And really, they are also the voting members of IPERC. So when we do have our discussions and decisions that need to be made on behalf of the council and recommendations to the steering committee, this is the group that votes on those decisions that we make as a collective, and put those forth. And really that there is just highlighting a bit of the diversity of the nations that we come from as well. You know, there are Métis and Anishinaabe and Cree representatives, and there's also a couple of our West Coast relatives from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation and from the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation, and also one of our relatives who is Inuvialuit. And so, we just like to highlight and respect these voices of our council members here from IPERC that really help to share our expertise and the diversity that we bring to the network as a council here. Next slide, please. In addition, we have IPERC members who are non-voting members. However, they also do bring their expertise and guidance to the decision-making discussions of the council. They also represent collaborating organizations that Can-SOLVE and IPERC work together with to advance Indigenous kidney health and wellness. And so I just like to highlight some of our other members here that participate in our activities as a council. Next slide, please. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its report with the 94 calls to action was launched in 2015. And after several years, there are still many of the calls to action which need implementation throughout government, throughout institutions, throughout organizations. And really, for IPERC, this is a part of our vision and mandate as well, as to answer and highlight these calls to action in the work that we do going forward. And so within the network, there are 3 health calls to action from the TRC report that IPERC outlines in our purpose and mandate. And so call to action 18 calls upon governments to acknowledge the current state of Indigenous health and to implement healthcare rights of Indigenous peoples identified in international and constitutional laws, as well as in the treaties. And so that's a part of our work, is acknowledging this work, and that there's a work that we need to implement in order to carry out this action. The Truth and Reconciliation call to action number 19 indicates establishing measurable goals to identify and close gaps in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, with efforts focusing on indicators such as chronic diseases, illnesses, and injury incidences, and the availability of appropriate health services. So it's really important, I think, as IPERC, for our work to really help close these gaps in our health outcomes with kidney disease. And the third TRC call to action here is, it's threefold, really. It's to increase the number of Aboriginal and Indigenous professionals working in the healthcare field, and to ensure the retention of Indigenous healthcare providers in Indigenous communities. And really the most relevant part of this next call to action here is relevant to the work of Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj pathway, and that is to provide cultural competency training to all healthcare professionals, and that we've developed this training for research team members and for network members within Can-SOLVE. Next slide, please. So IPERC and creating safe spaces, I just wanted to highlight these 3 points here, that being a SPORE-funded network strategy for patient-oriented research, that really the patient voice is really the highlight and the most important, I think, aspect of our work going forward. And so within the context of IPERC as well, engaging and amplifying voices of Indigenous patient partners in the network, it really is our goal, and really that's a part of why we're here. And so part of that, few examples of that is really, voices of patient partners are shared at presentations that we do at conferences, and within the working groups that we have in the network. That's really important, where our voices are heard. And with that, the second point here is creating safe spaces. And I think it's important to create these safe spaces within all of the committees and working groups that we're involved in. And for IPERC, a part of creating safe space is our meetings that we hold. We hold them monthly, but they do alternate. So every other month, we focus on Can-SOLVE network activities and work that we're doing there. But in those other months, we host our Tea and Bannock sessions for our council. And so that's really a space for us to come and maintain our relationships with each other, share about things that are going on outside of the work of Can-SOLVE, that really brings us together as well, because we don't always just want to talk about our kidney disease. We want to know about other things that are happening in our lives, and the successes that are going on, and the good things that that are happening in our community. So that space is open for our council members there to come and share that. And lastly, IPERC really is a part of building relationships between Indigenous people and allies. And I think it's really important to have allies as well, to help take on some of that emotional labor that's pretty heavy in the work that we do. And so really appreciate too the allies that we do have, because the power and privilege that our allies have in the systems that we're working in, they really do help to open that space as well for us to come and share these experiences and share the priorities that we have as Indigenous people and communities and nations. And so that's one thing I wanted to highlight about that allyship, is those allies that come and provide those opportunities to speak to their circles of influence and to help us do this work in advancing cultural competency. Next slide, please. So some of the key activities here is, again, I've indicated the first point here, but I think because of the work we're doing, it needs to be said again and again. And so engaging and amplifying voices of Indigenous patient partners in network activities is really the forefront of IPERC's activities. In addition to that, that we are here to also, and I'm here as well as IPERC coordinator, to support project teams with engagement strategies. And just to mention, often there's letters of support that are asked, and IPERC is developing our mandate as well around, sometimes I think when letters of support are offered, we'd like to see that, some of those cultural competency learnings have been undertaken as well. And so we're developing some criteria as well in terms of sharing and collaborating with groups. Is we want to raise the cultural competency awareness and cultural safety of the work that we're doing. And so, just to be aware that this is something that we're working on as well, to work together as we go forward in this work. And that's really an important part, is strengthening cultural competency. And so you'll hear more about the learning pathway as well in some of our presentation upcoming. So next slide, please. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. So I just wanted to highlight that IPERC and Indigenous Initiative support. Just wanted to make mention that you'll see in the next slide our contact information, but that we will be adding another Indigenous team member to our core team. And so the support that's offered here really highlights our three members here who will be providing support in different capacities, but also working together to bring this work of highlighting Indigenous initiatives and our Indigenous work together. So project support, so consultation on engagement and cultural competency will be part of the role of the Indigenous liaison manager. And to the second point here, patient partner support will be kind of the role of the IPERC coordinator. And we understand too that there are project teams that have their own patient advisory groups and patient advisory councils, and just want to make mention that if there are your project advisory group that wants to connect with IPERC, if there's Indigenous patient partners on there that maybe aren't sitting on IPERC, that we want to provide that space as well for them to connect with us in the council to maybe come to a team bannock session and connect on our kidney journeys together And the last point here is the access to ongoing Indigenous cultural competency trainings, workshops, and learnings. And that will be part of the role of our new team member coming on in terms of managing cultural competencies. So you'll be hearing and learning more about that role at a later date. So next slide, please. And then this is just the contact information for Catherine Turner, who is the Indigenous Liaison Manager, and my contact information as IPERC Coordinator. So if you have any questions, concerns, please reach out to us. Next slide, please. And here I just wanted to highlight it's something that we'll be putting forth again for the second year. 2021 was the inaugural year where this award was created in honor and memoriam of one of our relatives who was on IPERC, and his name was Howard Vincent. And so I'll just say Howard Vincent Abun. And we usually add Abun to the end of our relatives' names when they've passed on, just to denote that they're no longer here in the physical world with us. And so this award in honor of the late Howard Apan is to honor an Indigenous individual who has demonstrated commitment to furthering reconciliation efforts with Indigenous peoples in the network, and who's inspired others to continue their truth and reconciliation efforts. So I think, as I had mentioned earlier, those TRC calls to action, I think those are relevant not only to IPERC, but to all of us who are doing this work, not only with Indigenous people, but that, our research here will reach Indigenous people. So there should be some learnings that are learning about history and the current state of Indigenous health and wellness. So just want to highlight this award, and we'll be looking forward to sharing more about this in the future, about the second year that it'll be presented. So next slide, please. And I just wanted to say here that we have two testimonials. One is from one of our IPERC co-chairs, Arlene Desjardins, who's going to share a little bit about her involvement in IPERC and some of her experiences as a patient partner within the network. And secondly, Dr. Joanne Koppel will also share some insights in her involvement with IPERC and just some recommendations that she provides as well to her circles of influence and fellow researchers. So with that, I'll just ask to play the video here, and you'll hear from them.
I am a Métis woman from the Red River Métis Nation here in Winnipeg. I was also the caregiver to my late husband, Glenn. It's been absolutely life-changing for me. I've met incredible people. I've learned so much about myself. I continue to learn every day. Again, I lived as a person, but now I can freely say that I'm living as a Métis person who's learning about herself and her culture and the world around her. And that, for me, is what Can-SOLVE has brought into my life, specifically IPERC and the learning pathway. I wouldn't have known that, because that's just not how the world I knew before existed. Now it is. I live it every day, and I see things completely different because of being part of IPERC and the learning pathway and the people that have come into my life as a result of it. So I had the opportunity to write a paper based on an experience, a moment in care, they call it, with a physician, Dr. David Collister, back in 2015. At the time when Glenn was at the height of his illness, he was in need of something. And I had never met Dr. Collister. He had never met me. And I was very insistent about something, that Glenn get treatment. And I went off and made a phone call with him. It turned out that I was actually right, and he wasn't. There was a miscommunication somewhere along the line, and between who he was talking to and who I was talking to. And ultimately, at the end, Glenn got exactly what he needed because I was persistent. Anyway, we fast forward to the very first meeting I went to in Vancouver, and that meeting, for so many different reasons, was absolutely a changing point for me. I ran into Dr. Kloster on the Sunday. We were doing the Kairos blanket exercise. I ended up ironically in the same group as him. And he turned around, I turned around, and we instantly knew who each other was. And I was instantly mortified by my behavior that I knew was bad. You know, and I went to apologize to him, and he stopped me and he says, no. Don't ever apologize for what you did that day. Because what you need to know is you changed me that day. Because of you, I'm a better doctor today. Because of you being so insistent and so relentless for what Glenn needed. He says, I actually now take the time to listen to my patients when they are that insistent about something. I did a presentation a couple of years later, a virtual one, and somebody in the crowd heard it, and we were then approached by CMAJ to write a paper about it and have it published possibly in a medical journal, the medical journal. And it was. Based on our experience, we each wrote our perspectives on it. It was published, and the feedback that we've gotten, he's gotten, I've gotten, have been incredibly humbling. And it brought for me the one thing I've always said is I never wanted Glenn to be a statistic. And I have learned so much, not only about myself, but about what it's like to be an Indigenous person, because I never really paid much attention to that before. So I see us as just being, with IPERC, just being leaders in the field of research in terms of patient partners and what we have to give back to the community. You know, there's so much work to be done out there, and we've just started to do the work. And I don't mean that in the way it sounds. It means that we've started, we just can go up, further and further with what we're doing. And just, you know, it makes me proud to say that I'm part of IPERC, and I just see so much potential for us and so much work that is yet to be done, and so much work that we are going to contribute to. I mean, we're being looked at as leaders in our fields, as patient partners with the research community. I mean, you just have to look at the land acknowledgement that was non-existent prior to, like, I don't really remember that being a part of any part of the groups that I was. And now every meeting starts with a land acknowledgement. I mean, that is just huge to me, and that just makes me so proud. And I think anybody that's involved in Can-SOLVE should have a touch with IPERC and the learning pathway. There's so many different teachings and so many different lessons to be learned by everybody. Our community is the biggest sufferers of chronic kidney disease. Everybody that's in the Can-SOLVE world should know who we are and what we do.
Hello, everyone. I am Joanne Koppel. I am a nephrologist in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I am one of the co-leads for an Indigenous project for Can-SOLVE CKD. And that project is called Improving Indigenous Patient Knowledge About Failing Kidneys. As one of the leads for an Indigenous project, I am also a non-voting member of the Indigenous Patient and Engagement Research Council. And I've been actually on the council since its inception many years ago. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Can-SOLVE Knowledge Translation and Knowledge Mobilization Committee within IPERC is as a non-voting member of the IPERC Council. I've also been working closely with Craig Settee and Catherine Turner on the Knowledge Keepers in Research Guidelines and Protocols, which is a component wah-bish-kih, biish-ih-goo, skaa-nch learning pathway. And so that's been actually a really wonderful learning experience, and something that I think that all members and team members for Can-SOLVE should read and know about, because protocols are really complex social practices that should definitely need to be followed when people are interacting with Indigenous people and communities. And sometimes people may not know what those protocols are. And so I would encourage people to ask someone in the community what the local protocol is, because protocols are not the same throughout the province or provinces, and there may be different between communities as well. I was very fortunate to receive the Howard Vincent Reconciliation Award in 2021. I have to say that was a very humbling experience because I don't think I really deserve that award. Howard was a colorful character, but he really inspired, I think, all of us in the Can-SOLVE CKD Network to reflect critically, to really listen, I think, with our heart and mind, and to respect one another's opinion. And he really pushed us to have uncomfortable conversations, and he really was a force for change. And so receiving that award, I think, has strengthened my desire to be a strong voice for change and to be hopefully a strong ally so that we can better the health and living circumstances of Indigenous people who've not always had those opportunities. And with the 60 scoop and intergenerational trauma, you cannot stick your head in the sand. You've got to take your head out of the sand and learn about those things, because that's going to actually help you grow, make you a better doctor, make you a better researcher, and make you a better person. So just because you don't have direct Indigenous involvement in your project does not mean that you should not do this and that you should not learn more. And I think all people within Can-SOLVE 2.0 really do need to take the various learning points on the learning pathway, the Karos blanket exercise, Sanya's training, OCAP, whether or not you're dealing with Indigenous people or not, because that is a measure of your own personal growth. And if we want to be a better, healthier society, that's what you have to do.
Well, so those are our testimonials that were shared by Arlene and Joanne, and we're really grateful to them for sharing their voices and their experiences. So next we're going to talk, I'm going to give an overview a little bit about the learning pathway, and I'll ask to go on to the next slide, please. So the learning pathway, called Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj, is designed to enable research team members to build culturally safe and respectful partnerships with Indigenous peoples and communities in health research. And you'll see a link there at the bottom to take you to the learning pathway where you can learn a little bit more. And I just wanted to mention this logo was also designed by Jesselyn King, who's an Indigenous graphic designer who's worked with us on a couple of our works with the learning pathway. Next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to highlight that the learning pathway has also developed and really highlighted the use of these 4 L's. So the Can-SOLVE tagline was listening, learning, and leading. And when we were giving the identity to the learning pathway, one of the knowledge keepers we worked with identified that that observational piece was missing in that tagline. And so since then, looking has been added. And so we call those the 4 L's. And that's part of our encouragement to participants, is to look, listen, learn, and lead their way along the pathway. And so with that, I'll ask to go to the next slide. This pathway, Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj, loosely translates to meaning white horse. And that was just part of the vision from knowledge keeper Dan Thomas, who provided that name through a pipe ceremony that we did back in 2018 in Winnipeg. And with that name, there were 4 colors that came. So there's white, blue, red, and yellow. And you'll see that indicated in the logo there that I mentioned was designed by Jesselyn King. And, you know, she did a really good job of capturing the story and the vision that Knowledge Keeper Dan shared with us around this learning pathway. So with that, next slide, please. And this is just a brief image of the learning pathway. So you'll see these are all the learning markers that are a part of Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj. And over the next several slides, we'll hear a little bit more about each one of them in detail. So let's play our, oh, I just wanted to make mention, you know, the Land Acknowledgement series is one that we've developed recently, and it's the first stop on there. So we just had a testimonial from Sean Delaney of Canadian Blood Services, who is really an organizer of the organ and tissue donation and transplantation part of Canadian Blood Services. So just to read this quickly is the Land Acknowledgement series from the Can-SOLVE CKD Network has been an absolutely invaluable resource to start many in our organ donation and transplant team on their journey to understand the importance of knowing the history of colonialism Canada and the resources to create and evolve each person's individual land acknowledgement statement. I personally am constantly updating the language of my own personal statement, in no small part due to the training of Can-SOLVE CKD, as it has started me on a very individual path to appreciating the custodians and leaders that protected and protect the land that I explore, recreate, and live on since time immemorial. So with that, I'll go on to the next slide. And
I'd like to, first of all, let you know about a new land acknowledgement learning series. This is a series that's intended to inspire a deeper understanding of land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are important because they connect us, whether we are Indigenous or non-Indigenous, with the original inhabitants, the Indigenous inhabitants of the area where we are living or visit. And it's an important thing because we have to then appreciate the connections that we have as allies or visitors with the people who do live and have always lived in the territories where we are. It's a free resource, including 4 webinars, and it's led by a series guidebook. It's funded with generous support from the BC Renal Agency. Next slide, please. So the Land Acknowledgement Learning Series it's actually utilizing the 4 L's from Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj learning pathway. This is looking, listening, learning, and leading. And those are in that order because those are a natural order. We first of all need to observe, we need to pay attention, we need to learn, and only then can we lead. So listening and learning from Indigenous and non-Indigenous experiences and knowledges, it's very important, and it's important for everyone really in the network. And I invite you to use this series guidebook. Next slide. So there's a number of outcomes that are in this series. As individuals, we need to create our own personal land acknowledgement. So it can't be just a routine pronouncement of words. We need to think about our connections with the territory on which we live or work or play. It helps to create a better cultural competency and humility. It responds to the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, number 24, where we're invited to appreciate the history of Canada and Canada's Indigenous peoples and to learn about our relations. And finally, of course, we want to encourage everyone to participate more in the trainings outlined in Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj. Next. And then I also want to draw your attention to the Kairos blanket exercise. This is a very important thing that really everyone should take part in, because it's a dramatic way of exposing us to the realities, the historical realities that First Nations, Inuit and Métis in Canada faced as the colonial powers and expansion moved across Canada. And we need to be aware of that historical relationship because it affects health. It affects every aspect of life. And the historical relationship, it's important that we understand it so that we can appreciate the context in which Indigenous peoples live and their relationship to Canada. So thank you very much, Miigwech.
Tansianin Buju. We find it really important for this particular Sanya's cultural safety training, because one of the areas is that it's available online, and Sanya's is also a facilitated training program designed to increase knowledge and enhance self-awareness and strengthen the skills of those who want to work both directly and indirectly with Indigenous people. The beauty of this program is that you work on it at your own pace. You're given 8 weeks to complete the modules, and it is online, and it's also self-directed. There's the beauty of it as well too is that it is interactive, as in there's videos that you can preview of the various teachings and learnings around Indigenous people. This program also has a focus as well too from BC perspective, from a Manitoba perspective, and also on an Ontario perspective. So when we look at this, you'll see here in this next slide that cultural competency is one of the parts of doing culturally safe research and health care. So, this particular training is very critical. It sets the foundation for understanding not only cultural competency, but also cultural proficiency. And it's very useful for researchers, especially those who are working with Indigenous patients and communities. And we really feel that this is a critical part of the learning pathway because it sets the stage for your understanding and learning and teachings when you're dealing and working with patients who are living with not only chronic kidney disease, but those who have also experienced kidney transplantation or kidney donorship. The fourth marker for the Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj learning pathway is something that we call Indigenous research ethics and protocols. So this particular webinar series is self-directed. It's 3 parts, and it examines ethical principles of engagement when you're working with Indigenous peoples in health research. And so, we really encourage you to take a look at, these webinars that are available. The first part of the Indigenous Research Ethics and Protocols webinar series is Indigenous Worldviews and Indigenous Research Ethics Principles. So when Dr. Malcolm King walks you through, the webinar and through his presentation, he talks about in here the part about including wellness in research, which is really critical to, our communities, because one of the parts that is really important in finding that balance is that balance, with ourselves as humans beings, that wellness part is also really critical and important when we're talking about research, ethics and protocols. So Dr. Malcolm Kim goes more into detail about what that means and how it's a way in which research ethics and protocols is really being encouraged for researchers to embrace in their work. In part 2 of Indigenous Research Ethics and Protocols, Dr. King talks about how to understand the history of colonization and its impact on health research. So part of this webinar talks about why do we need to consider history and how does history inform health? So you'll see that historically, we had, very healthy ways of living and being until, we got introduced to, other foods that impacted, our food sovereignty and food security. And then finally, Dr. King will talk about understanding the importance of relationships and reconciliation. And so in here, when we're talking about, looking at Indigenous health research, those are very important principles to also learn and understand. So finally, when we talk about ethics, Indigenous research ethics and protocols, this part talks about acquiring the skills to engage Indigenous peoples and communities in health research and in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. And so when we talk about in research ethics and protocol, we need to understand, the context and the relationality that we are embracing when we're doing health research. And, in terms of context and relationality, those are very foundational, because when we talk about relationship, we talk about building those relationships, not only with communities, but as well too, when you're working in those communities, knowing and getting to know and respect the people that we're working with. Those are really key concepts of relationality. As well too, within research ethics and protocols, we also have to understand ceremony and its role within research. Part of our way of being, knowing, and doing is critical when we talk about our role in research. And so Dr. King helps us understand why ceremony is important and is critical in understanding ceremony and its role within research. In this last part, we also talk about navigating institutional barriers and challenges. And finally, one of the last points that Dr. King will share in this webinar series in part 3 is around finding those resources and finding the support, in working with communities, in health research, because, we can't no one organization or network or can do this alone. We have to do this work collaboratively and, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation and for the betterment, of our communities, for our families, for our children and for future generations. So I really strongly encourage you to take a look at this webinar series, and we really hope that you will learn something and be able to apply it to your work. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Malcolm and Helen for sharing those teachings. The next stop on the learning pathway is the knowledge keepers in research. And I know we're getting to the top of the hour, but I will get through these slides really quickly here. So the Knowledge Keepers in Research book really helps to foster culturally aware and competent space for researchers and patient partners and knowledge keepers to come together, and really to encourage researchers to honor the various forms of knowledge alongside Indigenous knowledge keepers and translate these teachings into practice, and really with an aim to close the gaps in healthcare outcomes. And this work for the Knowledge Keepers and Research book was also funded in part by the Diabetes Action Canada group. Next slide. So just 7 themes emerged out of the interviews that were done with the 11 knowledge keepers. And one of the knowledge keepers, Lillian, envisioned a braid because of these 7 themes. And that braid teaching is really important. And so we also include in that book just a quick teaching about a braid and about sweetgrass, because those are teachings that also come from the territory that Knowledge Keeper Lillian comes from. So you can read more about that in the book. And these are the 7 strands, 7 themes that came out of those interviews with the Knowledge Keepers. So there's an essential foundational teachings that they explore in there. They talk about preparing for a meeting with the Knowledge Keeper, and really one of those big preparations is also preparing what your intention and what your ask is. And so they also identify a little bit about the ask. What goes into the ask is also some acknowledgement and protocol. And so they share some teachings around there from their distinct nations as well about that. They talk a little bit about knowledge, what kind of knowledge are people seeking, and what knowledge they are willing to share in a given instance, and also about who a knowledge keeper is, because some nations, those teachings also differ a little bit. And really the foundational of all of this is relationships, building them and maintaining them. And so with that, next slide. So here's a picture of the Knowledge Keepers. We gathered back in October of 2019. And here's our group. And I really just wanted to highlight a quote from Dr. Malcolm King, who says, quote, in regards to involving knowledge keepers in research, that it's important to move away from learning about them and to learn from them, and that knowledge keepers and elders can play a really important role in that, end quote. Next slide, please. The next learning marker here is around training and certification. So we highlight First Nations principles of OCAP in here, which stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. And really, we encourage research teams to take this training just in terms of understanding First Nations principles of data management and stewardship. And so really to highlight this one and encourage people to look further into taking that with your research teams. Next slide. As many of you know, the researchers, I'm sure many of you within your studies to become doctors have also taken the TCPS2, and I really just wanted to highlight Chapter 9 here, which focuses on research involving Indigenous people. So we highlight continuing to use this Tri-Council resource. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'm really excited to also announce just that we've launched the Cultural Competency Knowledge Bundle. It's a self-directed resource page with a collection of multimedia used to support you on your continued cultural competency journey. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And on the next slide, I'll share a couple of the resources that are available in there. So next slide, please. One of our IPERC members and a couple of also collaborators have put out a recent article called Furthering Cultural Safety in Kidney Care Within Indigenous Communities. So Dr. Mary Smith has helped lead that in association with a few of our network members. So we highly recommend taking a look at that as well. And some of the videos that would recommend is Can Good People Participate in Systemic Racism? And that's a webinar put on by Cecil Swainson, who is out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And we really encourage as well Research is Ceremony, the book by Sean Wilson. And we mentioned relationality a few times in the presentation, and that's really a concept that came out of that work that Dr. Sean Wilson has done. So next slide, please. What's next? In the next years as we're working together, we're really working to mobilize and implement the knowledge and learnings from Wabishki Bizhiko Skaanj. As well, we want to identify additional learning gaps and how we can work to address those. And as well to, part of our knowledge mobilization plan is really to continue developing, enhancing the existing materials in there and creating some additional, guides to complement the work that's been done so far. So with that, go on to the next slide, please. With that, I will say miigwech, egosani, marci to all of you. And I live on the coast now, so one thing they do is they raise their hands. So I'll say miigwech, and I'll raise my hands to you in honor of the place that I now live in, Vancouver, in Coast Salish territory. So thank you. if there's any questions, please toss them in the chat box. I know there's still a few folks on the call here. Be happy to maybe field one question before we end the webinar. I see a few thank yous from folks. We really appreciate everybody who could attend today's session, and hope that you learned a little bit about the work that we're doing, and that you're able to connect with myself and our team here at Can-SOLVE. And so on the next slide is just our contact information. And if you do have any questions or answers, please, questions or comments, please reach out to me and view our website here in our learning pathway portion. I know I just saw a question come up there about accessing OCAP. OCAP is put on through partnership at Algonquin College and First Nations Governance Center out of Alberta. And so they have spots that you purchase to take OCAP, and that's something that we've been working to do within our network is purchase spots and offer them to our network members. And so that's something we'll be doing going forward as well, and encourage other groups to also put funds in your budget line specific to Indigenous training and Indigenous cultural competency, and really help to build up the knowledge base of all of our research teams and all of our work going forward as a research community, as a kidney community, and just something that we advocate for as an IPERC council and as a learning pathway group. So with that, I'll say miigwech. I don't see any other questions on there today, and thank you for staying on with us here a few extra minutes, and appreciate all of your time. And please reach out to me if you want to chat or anything further.